Hello, and welcome to this week's podcast, The Fate of the World, Election 2024, Walz. Tim Walz is running as the vice presidential candidate on the Kamala Harris ticket. Most of us don't pay very much attention to the VP candidates, but we should. After all, they hold the second largest amount of power in the entire country, arguably in the world. All it takes is one crisis for them to become the president that you're stuck with for years to come. And we should at least ask ourselves how comfortable we would be with that scenario. And the choice of VP tells you a lot about the presidential candidate themselves. It tells you about their values. It tells you about their judgment, good or bad. It tells you about the type of people they are likely to surround themselves with and appoint to other positions of power. It tells you about their intentions. Have they selected someone who will help balance them towards the moderate middle or towards the fringe extremes? It is really your first clue of what to expect from the administration that it is being proposed you should choose. So, after taking a look at Donald Trump's choice last week when we discussed JD Vance, let us now turn our consideration to the stability of Kamala Harris's judgment in choosing Tim Walz. The first time I paid any attention to Tim Walz was a few months ago when he told the news media, quote, "Don't ever shy away from our progressive values. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness." That didn't go over well with me, or with anyone who knows even a little bit of history. The name Nazis is an abbreviation for the German words for National Socialist German Workers' Party. The Nazis were socialists, and I know exactly what kind of neighbors they made to people like Anne Frank. Socialism is only one step removed from communism, which killed more people than the Holocaust did. All this may be a radical's idea of neighborliness, but it isn't mine, and it isn't most people's. But Tim Walz is a self-professed knucklehead, so maybe he just said something dumb out of ignorance, as we all occasionally do. So I began looking into his history and his other positions, and here's what I found out. Tim graduated in 1989 with a social science degree from a college in Nebraska. He taught for a year in China, then returned to full-time status in the National Guard and a teaching career. He taught social studies and was a volunteer assistant football coach at a high school in Minnesota. He ran for Congress in 2006 while in his early 40s. He ran as a moderate, but deceived his constituents as all his positions were far left, as we'll get into in detail later on. He spent 12 years in Congress, then ran for governor. He won by 11 percentage points in 2018 on a platform of being willing to compromise with Republicans. When he won his re-election campaign, though, in 2022, it was only by 7 percentage points because his constituents now knew he was a radical in his policies, and he lost the moderate vote. He wrote his master's thesis on Holocaust education, arguing that the Holocaust should not be taught in a unique way that emphasized it as being significant when compared to other genocides. Rather, he argued it should merely be listed in the context of genocides of any size and severity that happened anywhere else in the world. He doesn't believe that any of the unique features of the Holocaust should be taught to kids, but it should be simply made equivalent to any other attack of any size that has ever been made on any people anywhere in the world at any time in history. I feel obligated to remind everyone that 1/3 of the entire world's population of Jews were killed in the Holocaust. I would also remind everyone that 1.5 million of those victims were children. I would remind everyone, especially Governor Walz, that they conducted awful medical experiments on these victims in the camps. The Holocaust is a genocide that is actually unique in many ways and should be taught accurately. Something I thought the left was all for. Teaching the whole truth when it came to the dark parts of history like slavery. This is why you don't let volunteer football coaches teach a history class. They're not qualified. This record, when it comes to Jews, grows even more troubling the further you look into it. According to the Washington Examiner, more than 5 times Tim Walz hosted, as governor of Minnesota, a Muslim cleric, Asad Zaman, of the Muslim American Society of Minnesota, who openly celebrated the October 7th massacre and has repeatedly promoted a neo-Nazi film that glorifies Adolf Hitler. They got together in May 2023 as part of a group of Muslim leaders meeting with the governor, but Tim Walz had Mr. Zaman deliver the invocation before Walz's state address, and had even had him speak at another of Walz's events in May of 2020. So, as promised last week, when I discouraged people who live in glass houses from throwing stones, 6 degrees of separation between Kamala Harris and Adolf Hitler. 1. Hitler, idolized in a neo-Nazi film. That would be 2. Which was promoted by Asad Zaman. 3. Who was chosen to speak publicly several times at Tim Walz events. 4. Who was chosen as the VP running mate by Kamala Harris. That's 5. I didn't even need the 6th one. Walz also gave over $100,000 to the Muslim American Society of Minnesota, which is Asad Zaman's Muslim extremist group, a group that was deemed by the federal government to be an offshoot of the terrorist organization, the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Washington Examiner just keeps uncovering more and more relationships between Walz and radical Muslim groups. Quote, under Governor Tim Walz, the state of Minnesota awarded over $2 million to an Islamic group that fundraises for a charity linked to an Al-Qaeda affiliate, according to funding records reviewed by the Washington Examiner. The Islamic Association of North America, the recipient of state grants from 2019 to 2024, is fundraising after Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel last year for Rama Worldwide, a Michigan-based charity that says it is shipping humanitarian aid to Gaza and has since deleted Facebook posts made in October 2023. Rama Worldwide President Shadi Zaza revealed his charity was collaborating on an aid initiative with the Islamic Heritage Revival Society of Kuwait, a terrorist group sanctioned by the U.S. government for funding Al-Qaeda. News of the Walz administration's grant to the IANA comes as the Democratic vice presidential candidate faces backlash after a series of Washington Examiner reports revealed his ties to Muslim cleric Asad Zaman. As Minnesota governor, Walz has repeatedly hosted Zaman, who shared a pro-Adolf Hitler movie on social media, and defended the October 7th attacks. He also referred to Zaman as a, quote, master teacher at a 2018 event. These are not the only shady stories in Tim Walz's closet. On September 23rd, 1995, when he was 31, so not a dumb kid, Walz was arrested in Nebraska for drunk driving. He was going 96 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone. The officer smelled alcohol on his breath, and Walz failed a field sobriety test as well as a breathalyzer test. The part that really bothers me as a disabled person, however, is that he tried to get out of the arrest by pretending to be disabled. Specifically, he pretended to be deaf. He made false claims to the officer that he did not understand what he was saying to him because he was partially deaf, and claimed that he had failed the sobriety test because of balance issues rather than drunkenness. And he acted out this reprehensible and undignified show as a fully grown man, not some 15-year-old boy, which might at least be understandable. He was charged with speeding and driving while intoxicated. He pled this down to reckless driving, for which he paid a small $200 fine. Walz has lied about this DUI since then. According to Andrew Kaczynski, a reporter for CNN, quote, "When Democratic vice presidential candidate nominee Tim Walz first ran for Congress in 2006, his campaign repeatedly made false statements about the details of his 1995 arrest for drunk and reckless driving. According to court and police records connected to the incident, Walz admitted in court he had been drinking when he was pulled over for driving 96 miles per hour in a 55 mile per hour zone in Nebraska. Walz was then transported by a state trooper to a local hospital for a blood test showing he had a blood alcohol level of 0.128, which, and this is my comment now, basically means he was marinating in alcohol. Getting back to the Andrew Kaczynski report for CNN, but in 2006, his campaign repeatedly told the press he had not been drinking that night, claiming he had failed his field sobriety test due to a misunderstanding relating to hearing loss from his time in the National Guard. The campaign also claimed that Walz was allowed to drive himself to jail that night. None of that was true. So, even though Tim Walz admitted in court that he had been drinking, even though we have the blood test to show he was extremely intoxicated, his campaign lied and said that he had not been drinking that night and that everything was a big misunderstanding because he's partially deaf, trying to spin the whole sad story as if he had been telling the officer the truth that night when he pretended to be disabled, rather than man up to the consequences of his own actions. On a more admirable note, Tim Walz served in the National Guard for 24 years, which I respect and appreciate. He was never deployed to a war zone during his service, which is fine. If you serve in the military but don't serve in a war zone, you are still a hero who should be thanked for their service. The problem only comes in if you lie and say that you served in a war when you didn't. That is what is known as stolen valor in the military. Walz never corrected the many articles that claimed he served in Iraq and Afghanistan during his run for governor. He even endorsed a book about himself that claimed that he had served in Afghanistan, which is untrue. And he was caught during this ongoing campaign when he claimed that he had carried weapons in a war, which was also untrue. Here is the clip that got him into so much trouble.
Hope woke up like many of you did 5 weeks ago and Dad said, "Dad, you're the only person I know who's in elected office. You need to stop what's happening with this. I'll take my kick in the butt for the NRA. I spent 25 years in the Army and I hunt. And I gave the money back, and I'll tell you what I have been doing. I've been voting for common sense legislation that protects the Second Amendment, but we can do background checks. We can do CDC research. We can make sure we don't have reciprocal carry among states, and we can make sure that those weapons of war that I carried in war is the only place where those weapons are at."
So that's what he said about carrying weapons in a war that was untrue and what caused all the controversy. If he had just never made these false claims about what he had or hadn't done during his service to the country, people would have had no reason to go digging, but now they did. It turns out that in 2018, when he first ran for governor, retired Command Sergeant Major Thomas Behrens and Paul Herr reported to Facebook that Tim Walz retired after 24 years in the National Guard when he learned that his battalion would be deployed to Iraq, and after assuring his fellow troops that he would join them there. These men who served under Walz said, quote, "On May 16, 2005, Walz quit, betraying his country, leaving the 125th Field Artillery Battalion and its soldiers hanging without its senior non-commissioned officer as the battalion prepared for war." End quote. He's been accused by the men who served with him as having selectively edited and embellished his military career for years to gain unearned advantages to his image, useful for his political career. They say that in early 2005, a warning was issued to the battalion, including Walz, to prepare to be mobilized for active duty for deployment in Iraq. Between the time the warning order was given and his retirement, Walz told the brigade command sergeant major not to worry, he would be going on the mission. That apparently was a lie, according to the people in his unit, and specifically according to the man who was deployed in his place, Tom Behrens. Walz retired in May, and the official order to actually deploy came in July, but the warning orders had come at the beginning of 2005. There is a difference between being in the military during a time of war and being a combatant in an actual war zone. And there is a difference between honorably retiring after many years of service and abandoning your men just as they are being deployed for war, especially after promising to stand by them. Thomas Behrens, the man deployed in Walz's place, said, quote, "I needed to hit the ground running and take care of the troops and tell them we are going to war." He had almost 500 soldiers under his command. For a guy in that position to quit is cowardice. And when your country calls, you're supposed to run into battle, not the other way. He ran away. It's sad. Here's what Mr. Barron had to say.
He abandoned us, what the hell kind of leader does that? He just, as soon as the shots were fired in Iraq, he turned and ran the other way and hung his hat up and quit. When he was a congressman, he bragged that he was a retired command sergeant major. I'm the highest ranking person ever in the House, and all this lie that he was telling. The state of Minnesota came out after 2018, after this was exposed, and they said, well, he can say that he served as a command sergeant major, but he can't say he's a retired one because he's not.
Between lockdowns, riots, unchecked crime, and a charred police precinct, Behrens felt he had no choice but again to come forward.
Allowing that to be burned down was just like having the Alamo get burned down. It's like, no, you defend that to the last man. If he would have went to Iraq, he'd still be hiding under his desk over there.
Nancy Pelosi tried to counter this unflattering revelation on MSNBC by accusing JD Vance of never having been in combat either during his 4 years as a Marine, during which time he was deployed in a war zone, demanding, has he ever been in combat? And was reluctantly informed that, yes, he was deployed in Iraq as a combat communications officer. But the real issue isn't a non-existent requirement that candidates must have been in a combat zone. That isn't a necessity, and no one's saying it is. The issue is about whether or not a candidate lied to the American voters about being in a combat zone. And worse, if he lied to his men about going with them. And JD Vance has never been accused by anyone of embellishing the details of his service. That's the issue at stake, however important that issue is or isn't to you individually. It was funny, however, when Senator Tina Smith told Jim Acosta on CNN, quote, Here is Tim Walz, who enlisted when he was 17 years old. He served in the National Guard for 24 years, and I'm not aware of any military service that JD Vance has ever served, so let's just make that comparison there. And what happened in the tragedy of the killing of George Floyd and the unrest, at which point Jim Acosta was haltingly forced to interrupt this embarrassing accusation, made with so much pride, to point out that, quote, he was in the Marines, but unfortunately the frequent foot-in-mouth moves of our elected officials only proves that many politicians on both sides of the aisle don't see ignorance as any obstacle to them running their mouths, and they feel no obligation to even double-check their assertions with a quick Google search before they make them, even given their claims of abhorring misinformation. We might want to consider demanding higher standards from our leaders in future. JD Vance went after Walz for more than just the stolen valor issue, however, saying, quote, Tim Walz is a person, again, who promoted rioters burning down the biggest city in his state. This is a guy who wants to give driver's licenses to illegal aliens. This is a guy who wants to take children away from their parents if those parents don't consent to sex changes for minors. This is a radical human being who comes from a far left wing of the Democrat Party. Tim Walz recently told MSNBC, quote, there's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech, and especially around our democracy. Here, again, I have to interject some facts for our volunteer assistant coach. He is completely wrong about that. I dislike all the misinformation as much as the next person, and I think it should be corrected when it's found. But the First Amendment specifically and deliberately ties the government's hands in restricting any kind of political speech, especially around our democracy, precisely so that we could not become a dictatorship which is able to stop its citizens from speaking out against it. They did this knowing that people being people, some of them might make false allegations which would have to be refuted, not silenced. The First Amendment reads, and I quote, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging, meaning editing, the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. That is very clear. The government is not allowed to pass any law that edits the people's right to speak. It makes no exception for misinformation or even for speech that turns out to be based on false allegations. After all, no one needs to make an amendment saying that we are allowing everyone to have approved, accurate speech that everyone likes, because nobody would object to that in the first place. The First Amendment is there to protect speech that none of us like, and says we'll just have to put in the effort to refute and disprove bad speech, but we don't get to silence it. Once again, this is exactly why you don't let football coaches teach a history class. They aren't qualified. And Walz's problem with America aren't limited to just free speech. He wants to abolish the Electoral College, which he says is undemocratic, even though it was created by the same founding fathers who created our democracy. Quote, I do believe the Constitution is a living document. I think Jefferson's quote about as mankind progressed and technology progressed, the document was to progress with it. That's how you deal with these things. But I do think you have to be very careful about some of those core principles. It always seems to me going back to the Senate and the filibuster, the Electoral College seems very undemocratic to me. I mean, I think at first blush. Okay, personally, I trust the Founding Fathers' judgment about what was and wasn't democratic more than Tim Walz's opinion, especially given his record on understanding our founding principles. But hey, maybe you feel differently. Maybe you want to put the fate of our constitutional freedoms in this guy's hands and let him rewrite it all. Maybe he can improve on the ideas that made us a beacon of liberty for over 200 years. I'd rather not take that gamble, but maybe you would. As the governor of Minnesota, he presided over the BLM riots, the most expensive and costly riots in our nation's history. If you're interested in refreshing your memory on the details of what happened in Minneapolis, listen to the episode I did on that called Revenge of the Normies Part 3B. After the riots, Governor Walz advocated for defunding the police and promoted cashless bail, which has and continues to contribute to soaring crime rates. He criticized crime rates under Trump's administration, but if you look at the charts, starting in 2019, when he became governor, the rates for robbery, rape, murder, motor vehicle theft, larceny, and arson all started climbing steeply, increasing in Minnesota while continuing to decline nationally. So, crime went up so much in his state during his governorship that his bad stats alone were bad enough to almost single-handedly tank Trump's improving nationwide stats, outweighing the decreasing crime rates of 49 other states. His state under him became that big of a hellhole for which, who is responsible? Him? No, Trump. All part of Trump's evil genius plot to bring crime down everywhere else, to hide his master plan to sink Minnesota, where Tim Walz was in charge. Okay, if you say so. Tim's wife went full-on self-harming monk in his cell with a whip and a bloody back during the dark ages over the 2020 BLM riots that burned down the largest city in her husband's state, saying, quote, "Those first days, when there were riots, I could smell the burning tires. And, that was a very real thing. And I kept the windows open for as long as I could because I felt that was such a touchstone of what was happening." I'm at a loss for words. I take that back. Yes, Karen, all the evils of slavery that happened 160 years ago can be wiped away if you breathe in the smell of burning tires long enough as you sit in your governor's mansion. I'm sure all the people that lost their homes, their businesses, their cars, their property, their livelihoods, and even their lives in those riots are grateful to you for savoring the smell in order to absolve yourself of your racially inherited sins. Here's a short ad covering Tim Walz's time in office as governor of Minnesota.
I've just signed Executive Order 20-01, declaring a peacetime state of emergency for the state of Minnesota. We need to stop congregating. We're going to close the bars. We're going to close the restaurants. We're going to close the places where we gather. Several 100,000 of your neighbors were just laid off. An entire industry has been shut down in the face of this, all for the greater good.
The governor, with the power of the state constitution behind him, has issued 104 executive orders affecting everything from schools to restaurants and bars to churches to basically every facet of everyday life.
Democrats who control the House are moving in the opposite direction. Some are pushing to put a mask mandate in state law.
Hi. have the diarrhea, why wear a mask to school? It helps to keep me safe.
Explosive testimony from a Minneapolis police union official who says that the governor ordered cops to abandon that 3rd precinct during this spring's rioting.
I was in the command post. I heard it. I heard the governor say, give it up.
At 9:32, Chief Arredondo calls the mayor to tell him they've lost control, can no longer maintain order in the city. And then at 10:13, Chief Arredondo, who's monitoring the scene from a couple blocks away, gets on the radio to announce defeat.
Get a citywide tone right now, and a loss of the 3rd precinct.
The 3rd precinct has been compromised.
The mayor said I request the National Guard. Ooh, I'm out this straight. We're going to have massively trained troops. No, you're going to have 19-year-olds who are cooks.
A similar ad run by his opponent in the race for governor records Walz saying, quote, Minneapolis and St. Paul are on fire. The fire is still smoldering on our streets. The ashes are symbolic of decades and generations of pain, of anguish unheard. And, quote, these are things that have been brewing in this country for 400 years. We cannot have the looting and the recklessness that went on. We cannot have it because we can't function as a society, and I refuse to take away the attention of the stain that we need to be working on. And finally, quote, now generations of pain is manifesting itself in front of the world, and the world is watching. Not everyone was so enraptured with the symbolism of it all. A state senator called on him at the time, describing her precinct as, quote, on fire, no police, no firefighters, no social control, constituents locked in houses wondering what they were going to do. That is an abject failure and cannot happen. According to the Wall Street Journal, he further harmed Minnesota by increasing taxes, even though Minnesota already had the 5th highest income tax rate out of all 50 states. He then added an additional 1% subtax on net investment income over $1 million and ensured that Minnesota still levied a death tax of up to 16% on top of what the federal rate takes, which is 40%. So over half of anything you inherit goes to Uncle Sam when Tim Walz has his way. But on the flip side, he attempted to give 81,000 illegal immigrants driver's license, photo IDs, and health insurance. He funded the North Star Promise program, which provides free college for students from a family with an income of under $80,000, including illegal immigrants, which you may think is a nice thing to do, but the question is, under the current economic conditions, do you want to pay more taxes in order to offer that program to people? Someone has to pay for it. Nothing in life is free. All programs cost money. So anytime you hear of a new program, the question isn't, is that something nice to do? It's, do I want that thing to exist bad enough to pay for it? Walz created a new 0.88% payroll tax in order to pay for 20 weeks each year of paid family and medical leaves. 26 weeks is half of the year. So he's going to raise taxes, presumably, if he gets into federal office, the way he raised them in his state, including raising taxes to pay for almost 6 months of leave from work. He also mandated 80% carbon-free electricity by 2030, with additional mandates, which says that Minnesota must reach 100% by 2040. We can only assume that he would bring all of his state government policies to the White House and make as many of them national policies as he can. To top it all off, Morgan Ortegas, a former policy advisor, said that Walz's history is full of weird views about the Chinese Communist Party. Quote, in fact, from 1989 to 1990, Walz taught a Communist Party-approved course in China around the same time as the Tiananmen Square massacre. Despite the political turmoil, Walz later argued that U.S. classrooms should avoid depicting China as a scary threat and instead focus on its complexity. From 1992 to 2003, Walz made nearly annual trips to China. He established a summer program for Minnesota high school students with funding from Beijing authorities. In 1994, he and his wife went to China for their honeymoon. In 2007, Walz downplayed U.S. concerns about China, labeling them as hyperbole. He compared the U.S.-China relationship to a drug user and pusher, implying that the situation was more nuanced than it appeared. In 2019, he advocated for deeper economic engagement with Beijing, despite ongoing human rights abuse, and argued for a solid, lasting partnership with China. Simply put, Walz has a very strange admiration for Communist China, calling them amazing and insisting that he was treated well during his time there, during all the early work he did in China. And, of course, he was called out in the recent debate for lying about being at Tiananmen Square, saying that he, quote, misspoke. And not to be nitpicky, but somebody has to start making these points. That isn't misspeaking. You were either there or you weren't. It's not like you genuinely thought you were there until someone corrected you, or you didn't know what the words "I was at Tiananmen Square" meant, and you used the wrong one. If I said, I was the first man to walk on the moon, that's not me misspeaking. That's me lying. By now, you may be seeing a pattern of getting less than the truth from Tim Walz. Walz also tried to teach his admiration for communism to his students, describing it as superior to our system. In November of 1991, he told them, quote, "It is a system in which everyone shares and gets free housing. It means that everyone is the same and everyone shares. The doctor and the construction worker make the same. The Chinese government and the place they work provide for housing and about 14 kilograms or 30 pounds of rice per month. They get food and housing." The House Oversight Committee released a whole report on Walz's ties to Communist China, which he has visited over 30 times. Walz also taught curriculum on government ethnic studies, teaching about racial capitalism and about how minorities suffer under European beauty standards, as well as requiring liberated ethnic studies in Minnesota schools in 2023, where first graders are taught to identify examples of ethnic inequality in systems of power. Whatever happened to teaching the 3 R's, which our kids are failing in? Here is what JD Vance had to say about the Harris-Walz ticket.
They make an interesting tag team because, of course, Tim Walz allowed rioters to burn down Minneapolis in the summer of 2020, and then the few who got caught, Kamala Harris helped bail them out of jail. So it is more instructive for what it says about Kamala Harris, that she doesn't care about the border, she doesn't care about crime, she doesn't care about American energy, and most importantly, she doesn't care about the Americans who have been made to suffer under those policies.
Tim Walz is also a supporter of destroying our nation's historical monuments, which you will know how I feel about that if you've followed my other articles. When he was speaking about those who had pulled down the Christopher Columbus statue, he said,
"It was an act of civil disobedience that we need to make sure people feel that there is a proper outlet to address what are legitimate concerns around what they view as a genocidal monument that they have to walk to in their democracy."
Okay. If the monument was committing genocide, if it was truly a genocidal monument, I'm okay with you tearing it down. Otherwise, let's look at the facts. A huge percent of the native population did die from disease brought over from Europe, against which they had no immunity. Accidentally spreading a disease is not committing a genocide. It is tragic, but it's not the same thing as Hitler rounding up the Jews and putting them in the ovens of Auschwitz. See the difference? Not every bad thing that results in people dying is a genocide. If that was a genocide, then the rats that came from the Middle East bringing the bubonic plague to Europe were also genocidal. And by that standard, COVID was a genocide. You've probably heard that Walz is very big on telling others to mind their own business. But ironically, no one has minded their own business less than Tim Walz. He said, quote, "Some of us in here are old enough to remember. I see you down there. I see those old white guys. Some of us are old enough to remember when it was Republicans who were talking about freedom. It turns out now what they meant is that the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. In Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make, even if we wouldn't make the same choices for ourselves. There's a golden rule. Mind your own damn business." First off, as much as I agree with the sentiment of people minding their own business, that's actually not the golden rule, dude. The golden rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And second, this from the man who in 2020 created a snitch hotline that encouraged people to report on their neighbors during COVID if they weren't following the lockdown orders instead of, quote, "respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make, even if we wouldn't make the same choices for ourselves." That hotline generated thousands of reports against people for playing basketball outside, walking their dogs alone, attending church voluntarily, and driving to the local gas station to purchase an unessential candy bar. They also reported on non-essential businesses that remained open and those that did not follow the masking mandate strictly enough to meet their tattling standards. Mind your own business is not a convincing motto from a man who actually encouraged his constituents to spy on each other and snitch to Big Brother like some Russian dictator. But this is the man who believes one man's socialism is another man's neighborliness, which gives you some context for this particular train of thought. And we all know what kind of neighbors socialists make. Meanwhile, Walz shut down bars, restaurants, hair salons, and small businesses as being non-essential during the pandemic, but kept open big box stores, liquor stores, and strip clubs as those were essential during COVID. He also prioritized medical care during COVID on the basis of race. BIPOC, meaning Black, Indigenous, or people of color, status earned more points in his state than medical conditions like hypertension or other pre-existing health factors when it came to rationing out life-saving COVID care. Being a healthy person from a chosen race earned the same amount of points as someone with advanced age, or being overweight, diabetes, and even kidney disease under Tim Walz. Are you concerned yet? Because I am. He made Minnesota into a trans sanctuary state for minors who would otherwise have had to wait until they were 18 to have gender-affirming care in their own state. This law provides puberty blockers and hormones to minors, which very often sterilizes them permanently. One of these drugs, Lupron, is even the same drug used to chemically castrate sex offenders. The law also allows these minors to receive irreversible trans surgeries. For more information on all of that, see my episode, More Than Life, More Than Myself, Part 3. He even mandated putting tampons in the boys' bathrooms of schools, including elementary schools. When some people criticize this waste of taxpayer dollars, Democrats defended this policy by accusing the skeptics of not understanding what it was like to need a tampon and not have one. And if we had been talking about taking tampons out of the girls' bathroom, then that would make sense. But since no one was talking about taking tampons away from people who need them, they just didn't want to pay for tampons for people who didn't need them, as no male in all of history has ever menstruated. And if some of them want to pretend to, they can do so on their own dime. Walz signed into law an order protecting gender-affirming care for children and called other states bullies for banning transgender care and hormones for minors. He also said that Minnesota agencies should not assist other states in returning these minors to a state that restricts children from receiving gender-affirming care. He said that the state, specifically schools, should not notify parents if their children identify as another gender, even though statistically that puts them at a higher risk for suicide, which the parents would not be aware of or watchful for. He signed all of this into law with a 12-year-old trans child standing next to him for the photo op. The Wall Street Journal admitted that, quote, Minnesota became something of a laboratory in 2023 for many of the party's goals once Walz had a legislature fully controlled by Democrats. Besides establishing the goal of a carbon-free electric grid by 2040, which is highly unreliable and therefore life-threatening during a Minnesota winter, I direct you to what happened in Texas, in the South, during a cold snap after they relied too heavily on wind and solar. Continuing with the quote, the state was also forced to pay family and medical leave, sick leave, and transgender rights protections, a tax credit aimed at low-income parents, and a $1 billion in investment in affordable housing. I want to interject a few undisputed but often unknown facts about climate-related issues. Climate-related deaths have decreased by 98% in the last 100 years. 8 times the number of people die from cold than those who die from heat. More people die today from bad climate policies, from a lack of access to energy, than the number of people who have died from the climate or climate-related disasters. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is at a nearly all-time low for the planet's history, which is why in the 70s the climate concern wasn't warming, it was that we were headed towards another ice age. I am not a climate denier. I do think we should be concerned about the climate, And I do think a portion of climate change is man-made, however large or small that portion may be. But out of a list of maybe 1,000 things that we need to be concerned about that are far more imminent, the climate crisis shouldn't even make it into the top half of that list when compared to the other problems we are facing. You have to prioritize things accurately, not emotionally. We do need to address climate concerns, but in its appropriate prioritization compared to the other issues, instead of panic-inducing tactics while we ignore other issues that are critical right now. And we need to address climate in a way that does more good than harm. That should be self-evident. After getting control of the legislature in 2023, Walz passed a lengthy wish list of his agendas. He said, quote, "Our wish list is a to-do list, and we're checking it off." So what was on this wish list? The Minneapolis Post says, quote, "With the help of a $17.5 billion surplus that would have been $19 billion had the DFL, meaning the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, not changed the way inflation was included mid-session, the 2023-2025 budget will be 40% higher than the current budget. Democrats then codified abortion rights, paid family and medical leave, transgender rights protections, driver's licenses for illegal immigrants, restoration of voting rights for felons, wider voting access, a $1 billion investment in affordable housing, including for rental assistance, background checks for private gun transfer. DFL legislatures also banned conversion therapy for LGBTQ people. And it's important to note here that this is not the same type of conversion therapy that has been used in the past. Things like electric shock and other highly controversial methods which were used on young gay people. This is banning an LGBTQ person from receiving regular talk therapy that they want because they are struggling with their sexual identity. This bans them from receiving the help that they, as fully grown adults, choose to pursue. He legalized recreational marijuana. He required a carbon-free electric grid by 2040, adopted a new reading curriculum based on phonics, and passed a massive $2.58 billion capital construction package. He made the taxpayers pay for all of that. His wish list of items, rather than rebuilding the cities that he let burn. Loyal to the party line, Walz defended the Afghanistan withdrawal in July 2024 on CNN.
Exiting a conflict is never going to be good. That situation was horrific. There were Minnesotans on the ground that were providing aid to that. I think the biggest thing is an understanding that the way that was prosecuted, the way that we tried to build stability, was simply going to be incredibly difficult. So, I served with Senator Cotton. I also know that a lot of his positions have been overly aggressive in terms of how the United States prosecutes a peaceful resolution. So, look, the Afghan withdrawal was tragic, but it was a long-standing situation that rolled over many, many months and over both terms of presidents.
He participated in covering up Biden's mental condition, saying in August of 2023 on Meet the Press,
First of all, he's been one of the most highly effective presidents we've ever seen. I sat in Congress for 12 years waiting for Infrastructure Week. He actually delivered on this. And look, Dean is a friend of mine. I love him. But I spent last weekend on Mackinac Island with Tony Evers and Gretchen Whitmer talking about how we're going to make sure that we win this for Joe Biden. Because this is not a debate about Joe Biden's age or experience. It's about a debate about protecting the democracy.
To make matters even worse, Jim Garrity of the National Review wrote, quote, The dirty, not-so-little secret about Walz is he's not a good manager. On his watch, the Minnesota government has endured one embarrassing scandal after another in telling mismanagements, fraud, waste, and abuse. Let's start with the state's handling of hundreds of millions of dollars. Minnesota's Feeding Our Future, the largest COVID aid fraud scheme in the country. Announcing a federal fraud indictment against the Feeding Our Future nonprofit, FBI Director Chris Wray called it an egregious plot to steal public funds meant to care for children in need in what amounts to the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme yet. The defendants went to great lengths to exploit a program designed to feed underserved children in Minnesota amid the COVID-19 pandemic, fraudulently diverting millions of dollars designated for the program for their own personal gain. This nonprofit used $250 million in federal funds in Minnesota to purchase luxury cars, houses, jewelry, and coastal resort property abroad. End quote. A state Minnesota audit concluded that the Minnesota Education Department was asleep at the wheel and had ignored red flags concerning the nonprofit. Local CBS News affiliates found, quote, the report from the legislative auditor found the Minnesota Department of Education's last review of Feeding Our Future was in 2018. It found serious issues with the nonprofit's operations, and it failed to follow up. The report said that by 2019, the nonprofit managed more than 6 times the number of sites than the average multi-state sponsor participating in the program. Would have been a red flag to a moderately intelligent person. Garrity continued, saying in 2022, quote, Walz signed into law a plan to pay Minnesota's frontline workers hero pay for their hard work during the pandemic. The state's initial estimate was roughly 667,000 people were eligible for hero pay, meaning they would receive $750 each. Within a few months, the state announced that more than 1 million Minnesotans had qualified, reducing that payment to a little less than $500. If an estimate that's off by roughly 330,000 people raises your eyebrow, you have good instincts. Not only were a significant portion of the recipients for hero pay ineligible, some of them were dead. The same thing was true in the Minnesota state's government's handling of grants for arts and behavioral health. Minnesota Department of Health and Human Services Behavioral Health Division did not comply with certain grant management policies, matching similar findings of a 2021 audit. End quote. His list of state mismanagement under Walz goes on and on. However, Walz made sure to establish automatic voter registration, allowing voters in his state to sign up for a permanent absentee option, as if there aren't already enough dead people voting. And by the way, the growth or lack of growth in a state is a pretty good test of the policies enacted there, if they are cutting the mustard in terms of making life better. And the population in Minnesota has been plummeting since 2019 when he took office, as masses of people are fleeing the multifaceted disaster going on in this state under Walz, the same way they're fleeing California. And since it's an issue everyone seems to want to discuss, Walz wants the most extreme abortion policies with no limitations up through birth, with no restrictions on the reason for the abortion, no matter how late in the pregnancy it is. and no restrictions on age at all, so that any minor, no matter how young they are, does not need to inform their parents or have consent for the procedure. Under him, at least 5 babies, 8 in total, were born alive after botched abortions and then allowed to die in violation of state laws and with no prosecutions. And his response was to block the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act that would have outlawed this kind of atrocity. So, let's quickly review. This is someone with a serious honesty problem. He's enamored with communist China. He doesn't understand what our founding documents guarantee or why they contain those guarantees, but he wants to rewrite our constitutional rights. He supports tearing down national monuments in order to give spooled up college kids an outlet. He turned his state into a sanctuary state for trans children who ran away and for illegal immigrants, for whom he provided full health care and free college educations at the taxpayer's expense. He let rioters destroy Minnesota's cities, then Kamala Harris bailed the worst ones out of jail with taxpayer money, and then they both led the charge to defund the police. He has fought to give licenses to illegal immigrants, increasing the likelihood of voter fraud during an especially intense election cycle. He wants to give voting rights back to felons. And even though his state already had the 5th highest tax rates in the country, he raised them even more. He has a long list of items that will require a lot of spending that he wants to add to the budget that we need to be slashing in order to survive as a country. He has multiple ties to people who are openly anti-Semitic Hitler fans and who fund sanctioned terrorist groups. He supports abortion policies that are far more radical than what the mainstream wants. He allotted medical assistance during COVID on the basis of race. He oversaw the state with the largest COVID fraud scam in the country. He mismanaged enormous amounts of money. The overall conditions of his state is so bad that people are moving away from it en masse. And he refers to himself as a knucklehead, as though that's charming, instead of completely subpar as a standard for someone with the kind of power he's asking for. Being a knucklehead isn't a quality that I look for or want in a leader of my country, especially with the world on the brink of World War III. Is this list something you want? They've tried hard to sell this ticket as moderate, which fooled me last time. But last time they lied to me, and I got the most radical administration in our nation's history by any metric. So this time I'm looking harder at the records and not listening much to all the fine promises. The record is radical. Kamala Harris said, and I quote, "I am a radical," while Tim Walz, when asked if he was a liberal in the sense of a centrist versus a more extreme progressive, he said, quote, "I'm a progressive." He did not choose to label himself as a centrist or a moderate, but chose the most radical of the options they gave him. Ilhan Omar is campaigning for Tim Walz, which rates an 11 on the radical meter. Walz bragged about Kamala's team during the recent vice presidential debate. That team being, according to him, himself, which we just covered, Bernie Sanders, an open socialist who got kicked off a commune for being too much of a mooch, Dick Cheney, the architect of the Iraq War, and Taylor Swift, whom you may like as a singer, but you still have to admit that she has absolutely no qualifications for running the world. She would probably admit that. I've gathered the info in this series together so you can look at the policies, the records, and the data in one place, the solid stuff that keeps getting lost under the noise and the narratives and the fairy stories about joy and feels. I hope you'll take yourself seriously enough to make whatever choice you make based on solid facts rather than insubstantial vibes. I'll leave you with a quote from George Orwell. He said, "Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind." Thank you for listening, and I hope you will join me next week. Until then, have a good week, my friends.